everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Maya and this is Inspired by Maya. So in today's video, I'm going to be doing another ruched button-up dress. I know that I've just released a video on one not too long ago, but that one's a bit different because the ruching isn't adjustable. This ruching is adjustable on the skirt, and also it has a shirt-like bodice, and the fabric isn't stretchy, it's woven. Well, my fabric does have a little bit of stretch to it, but for the most part it's woven. Anyways, I'm making it for my mum. So the pattern, I have like a basic block for her, and then I sewed it up in a shirt style with the skirt. I just adjusted it to make this shirt with the collar and everything, and then extended the skirt. So I'm just going to show you the pattern pieces now. I'm working with a viscose linen, and it is so nice. Like the colour, I love it. The beige, the natural tan looking colours, so pretty. Also, it has like these little natural speckles in them, which is just so nice. Anyways, let me lay out the patterns. Okay, so I've got all my pattern pieces laid out. I'm just going to briefly go over what they are. So this side is the front, this side is the back of the dress. Then we've got the sleeve, the collar stand, the collar, and then I've got about, is it 2.5 centimeter bias tape. I just made this with a bias tape maker. This is going to be for this side seam so that I can sew it on and sew down the middle to create the ruching channels. This is what's going to allow it to be adjustable. And then this is just I don't even know how wide it is, but I'm going to fold it in half and stitch it to make a long strap so that my mum can pull it up and down. This is the placket. Just like with my pink ruched dress video, the front needs to get gathered and then seamed into the placket for both sides. And then there's some darts that I need to sew up, Excella, and a placket. So obviously I've already prepped my pieces to make it easier for me to sew. So on the placket I interfaced, oh, it's not ironed on properly. I interfaced one side of it because this interfacing is quite stiff, and it said it was only medium weight, but it's really stiff. So I only did it on one side of the placket so that when I fold it, it's stable enough to do buttonholes. And then on one of the collars, and the collar, like, listen, that's like paper. Anyways, I've interfaced one of the collars and one of the collar stands, and also on the shirt. So my shirt placket is 2.5 centimeters. Then I add a centimeter to fold so that I can have a nice clean finish. So I interfaced that, fold it in, and there we have a nice crisp shirt placket. I have two sleeves as usual. I think that's everything, to be honest. I'm trying to decide what bit I should start on. I feel like I should start with the collar. So I'm going to start sewing up the collar first. So I just took the collar pieces and placed them right sides facing and sewed a straight stitch all around except for the shorter straight edge, which will get trapped inside the collar stand. On the collar piece we will need to do a pivot stitch, so as you can see here I'm just sewing normally, and then when I reach the corner I keep my needle in the fabric and I pick up the presser foot and turn the fabric so that I'm sewing along the other straight edge. But make sure that you're sewing with the correct seam allowance, and then just continue down to the edge of the collar and repeat again. So now you should have your finished collar, and you want to trim all the excess fabric off around the edges and on the top, and then we're going to flip it right sides facing out. Also, don't forget to cut off any excess threads that may get in the way later. So once it's flipped, you're going to want to give it a nice press with the iron, and then we're going to top stitch all around the outer edge. When you're top stitching, just take your time and don't rush it because you want everything to be neat and you want to have an even distance from the outer edge. If I was to do this step again, I think I'd lengthen my stitch because I just think it looks a bit better when the top stitches are a little bit longer. So now we're going to match up our collar notches to the collar stand. If you're making a pattern yourself, make sure that you add these markings on because they're essential to assembling it properly. If you're using a brought pattern, they should already have them on, so just make sure that you transfer the markings when you cut your fabric. To attach the collar to the collar stand, we're just going to trap the bottom of the collar to the longer edge of the collar stand, and you want to put them right sides facing. Then just sew a straight stitch all along that line. and trim your excess fabric again to reduce the ball. And again, you want to give your collar a press so that it lies completely crisp and flat. And that's the main bit of the collar done. Now for the straps, to make it easier for myself, I just made the bias tape, folded it in half and sewed a straight stitch all down the side. Now I'm just going to sew up the darts on the front and back of the shirt. When you're doing this, you want to back stitch at the start of your stitch, but don't back stitch at the end because we need to hand tie it off, otherwise we'll get like a really sharp point and we don't want that. Again, when you're sewing your darts, make sure that you're taking your time and that you kind of curve the stitch off at the top where the bust area is, just to kind of ensure that you don't get the harsh bump, but remember, don't back stitch. So now that I've sewn up the darts, I'm just going to do the shirt placket stitch just to secure the placket down in place. So usually I'd put it under the machine right sides facing up and do a nice top stitch on top, but I don't feel confident. Well, it looks pretty even, but I just really don't want to mess it up. So I'm gonna sew from the wrong side and just stitch neatly on the edge of here, but obviously the bobbin thread is what's going to show on the bottom. So if you do this, you want to make sure that your tension is correct so that you don't get any weird looping, or you know, you want your stitches to look good. Also, I'm lengthening my stitch to about I'll just do about 3, because you don't want it to look too like close together on the outside of your fabric. Guys, I got a little bit too happy. I wasn't supposed to sew the shirt placket up yet. So now I'm gonna have to unpick a little bit of the placket just so that I can open it up and sew it to the skirt bit. I can't believe I did that. It's because I took a break and then I came back and I wasn't thinking properly. So I've just finished ironing out the darts on the fabric and they've come out so nicely, like the lace so flat. I actually really like working with this fabric. It's really easy to work with. So now we need to work on the front of the skirt. So let me put the pieces out. So now we need to work on the front of the skirt. So I've got the 2 plackets here. Obviously one's gonna go on either side, and basically what we need to do now is make 2 long gathering stitches for on the center front of the skirt, and then we need to gather it so that it matches up to the same length as the placket, because then we're going to pin it inside and sew it together. Another thing I want to quickly mention about the gathering is that you make sure you don't backstitch at the start and the end, otherwise we can't pull on the threads. This bit may take some time because you want to make sure that everything's even along the skirt. You don't want any areas that have more gathering than others, so just try and space it out evenly and obviously match up on the other side of the skirt. Once you've finished gathering, just pin the non-interfaced side of the placket right sides facing to the gathered skirt section and do a straight stitch. Now this is what your skirt front should look like. You can give it an iron here if you want, but then it will press these like unnatural creases into the fabric, and I prefer to have that natural gathered look, so I didn't bother ironing it. But the next step is to attach the top section of the dress to the skirt. So obviously earlier I unpicked the bottom of the placket on the top section, and then I just pinned it to the skirt right sides facing, making sure that all the folds line up nicely, and then I went ahead and did a straight stitch. Once I finished sewing that seam, I just pressed the seam open and then overlocked both sides of the seams separately. I prefer to do this method of seams because then it's easier to do alteration if needs be, and this is what your seam should look like. By the way, this is called an open seam. So now we're just going to fold in the 1 centimeter seam allowance edge of the placket, and then fold over the 2.5 centimeter placket and line it up to the stitch that we made when attaching the placket to the skirt, and follow the folding lines that we ironed into the fabric for the top section of the dress. If you feel you need to, it's probably best to pin this bit because it can move out of place pretty easily, but I felt confident enough to just go ahead and do without the pins. But if you're feeling nervous, make sure you pin it. And this is what the placket part of your dress should look like now. Now I'm just assembling the back similar to how we did the front, so I'm just putting the top and the skirt together right sides facing at the waist and sewing it with a straight stitch. Then I'm ironing open the seam and overlocking both sides of the seam separately. Next you want to place the front and back pieces of the dress right sides facing each other and sew a straight stitch on the shoulders. and again I'm going to use the open seam method. I decided to jazz it up a little bit here and do some top stitching about 0.5 centimeters away from both sides of the seam line. And now it's time for the sleeves. So you want to take your sleeves and make sure you know which part of the sleeve is the front and the back, and obviously which way is right sides and wrong sides of your fabric. I always mark it on my fabric just to be sure that I know which is the back and which is the front side. I like to pin each side down and work my way to the middle and just ease it into the armhole. It may seem like your sleeve won't fit because sometimes there's extra fabric in the pattern, but because these pieces are cut on the bias, they have a bit of give in them, so if you keep pinning, unpinning and adjusting, eventually it will fit together. If you want, I can do a video a bit more in depth on sleeves, just let me know in the comment section. And then you just want to go ahead and sew the sleeves with a straight stitch and then overlock the seam afterwards. I didn't do an open seam on the sleeves just because I didn't feel the need to this time. And then after that I press the seam. Ideally you want to do it with the seam allowance facing in towards the sleeve, but I decided to do a top stitch, so I ironed it the other way. If you're considering top stitching, just remember this gives a more structured look to the garment, so if you want softer falling sleeves, I don't recommend you doing this. So the dress is almost finished. We just need to sew up these side seams. So the dress is in two parts. We've got both sides separate because I've got a seam down the center back. But before I do that seam, we need to sew up the side seam because this is where the ruching channels are gonna go. Now in my pattern, I put 3 centimeters seam allowance, and that's really too much because I was kind of overthinking it and I thought that it's gonna be hard for me to make the ruching channels if the fabric is ruched, but I forgot this side's not ruched, only that side is. So really I ended up making that bias strip for no reason. It depends on, like, I can still use it, but it depends on how I want the inside finish to be. So I can just sew up the seam with my 3 centimeter seam allowance, which is too much, and then I'd probably like trim it down halfway and then overlock the seams separately so that they are open seam like this, and then I would just stitch down, just like in my blue ruched trousers video. I'd sew down the seam allowance to make a channel. That's probably the easiest way to do it, so I think that's what I'm gonna do because because I'm kind of on a schedule again. My mum needs this dress by Friday and it's still gotta go in the wash to get the water soluble marker off, so I'm just gonna sew this up with 3 centimeter seam allowance, then I'm gonna trim it down a little bit to probably 1.5 centimeters, then I'm gonna overlock the edges, both of the edges separately, and then top stitch it down with, yeah, just top stitch it. So I just finished sewing the ruching channels on both sides of the dress, and I stopped whatever at the waistband and did it all the way down to the bottom of the the dress. So here's what it looks like on the right side. I ironed the seams before I did this, and then just did like a centimeter, 1.5 centimeters, thick enough to fit my ruching thread. Oh gosh. Thick enough to fit my straps through comfortably. So I've just done that along the length of the skirt. So to do that, I'm going to utilize my side seam, and because I have a waist seam, I have a seam right here where I need it to be. So the sides are stitched down like here, but the middle I'm just going to unpick so that I can thread the straps through there. Then once I've unpicked this bit, just to keep it neat and tidy on the inside, I'm just going to put this piece of fabric, which was the bias tape that I made for no reason. On the waistband will be the top of the ruching channel, so it's going to loop around like that. And when we get to the bottom, these are where the strings are going to be hanging out. So my seam allowance is 2 centimeters, so I would fold that in, or whatever my seam allowance is, about, let's say, 2 centimeters. So I'm just going to seam rip a hole on the inside of the seam allowance, not going all the way through basically. And I'm just going to mark that now. So I just went ahead and carefully seam ripped right along the waistline and on the seam allowance at the bottom. Then I sewed a piece of my bias tape onto the waist seam line, and to do this you want to sew on both sides of the tape and then down the center of it with a straight stitch so that we can loop the strap around it, and this is what it should look like. Next I decided to sew the centre back seam, so I just pinned right from the top of the dress down to the bottom and sewed it with a straight stitch. Make sure that your waistline seam matches up on both sides just to keep that consistent professionalism throughout the garment, and then do an open seam on the centre back. I also decided to top stitch the centre back seam because I don't know if you've noticed already, but I really like top stitching. Now the advice I would give on this is if you think you're gonna have to take in the seam at the back, don't do this step yet because it will mean you have to unpick a whole load of stitches, so make sure the fit is correct before you do this. Next, as you can see, I'm just attaching my strap to a safety pin, and then I started the process of threading it through the channels. So I start from the bottom of the dress and work my way up to the waistline and then loop it around that bias tape and come back down on myself. This bit can be quite tricky and tedious because the safety pin can come undone, especially if you haven't made your channel wide enough, and sometimes it depends on the quality of the safety pin. If it's a bit thin, then the metal is too flexy and it will move too easily, so try and get a sturdy safety pin. But for your ruching channels, you want them to be somewhat snug but somewhat loose enough for you to be able to slide the strap in and out easily. I struggled with this bit, but eventually I got it through. Now we're moving on to the final steps of the dress and back to finishing off the collar. So you just want to pin the interface side of the collar stand right sides facing the neck of the dress and sew a straight stitch. So I just finished sewing the interface side of the collar down, and this is what it looks like from the back. Just a nice neat seam. So I'm just gonna iron that, but before I do that I'm gonna explain the next bit. So I'm just gonna mark with my ruler 1 centimeter, which is my seam allowance, and then I'm just gonna mark it a line with my water soluble marker. That way I can be more accurate with my sewing. And then I'm just going to fold in the bottom by my seam allowance, which is 1 centimeter, and then I'm just going to top stitch it down right on top of that seam that we've made, and then we're going to have a nice neat line coming through onto the outside, and then that's the collar complete. You really want to take your time with this stitch because it's so easy to mess up, but when you do it right, it's just so satisfyingly neat. I also recommend that you use a walking foot for this bit if you have one, just because it allows the fabric to go through the machine a lot easier because it walks over the fabric instead of being dragged through, which makes the fabric move out of place slightly. And this is what the collar turned out like. It's so neat and I love it. And here's the underside of the garment. Now it's time to move on to the cuffs. I actually forgot about this part of the pattern, so I didn't mention it at the beginning, but you just need to measure the widest part of your hand so that the cuff can easily slip over it, and then choose your desired cuff length. I think I went for about 8 centimeters. So to make your pattern, you just want to mark your height, which is your desired cuff length, and your width, which is your wrist width. And then you're going to want to add 1 centimeter seam allowance all over that pattern, except for on one of the width sides, because we're going to cut this piece on the fold so that it opens out. Make sure you cut 2 of these pieces as well. So you just want to fold the piece of fabric in half widthways, right sides facing, and sew a straight seam along the side. Then you iron this seam open, no need to overlock, and then fold the cuff in half so you end up with this. This is obviously already ironed nice and sharp. Next we just need to do a gathering stitch on the end of each sleeve so that it matches the circumference of the cuff. Then pin and sew it in place with a straight stitch. Also, you want to overlock this seam so that it doesn't fray. And I realised I forgot to record the sewing the cuff to the sleeve, but hopefully my explanation suffices. Again, if you want me to do a more in-depth video on cuffs, just let me know in the comment section. So now we're at the second to last step, which is the buttonholes, which is probably the scariest bit because if you mess this up, the whole garment's ruined. So to prevent this from happening, I always take a scrap piece of fabric and test it on that. Obviously I tried to mimic my fabric exactly how it is, so I interfaced one side of it just like my placket is, and then I tested a buttonhole, and then I made sure I was happy with the width and length of my stitches, and once I was happy I decided to move on to my real garment. So I already marked my buttonholes onto my garment with the water soluble marker, making sure that they're all evenly placed. Then I just put my buttonhole foot on my machine and made a bunch of buttonholes. Even though I tested it beforehand, it's still so nerve-wracking to do it. But to be honest, it depends on the kind of fabric that you use, because this was a viscose linen, so it's quite sturdy just like cotton, so it can handle the buttonhole without moving too much. Next, I just pinned the center front of my dress closed through the buttonholes and marked through the buttonholes with a water-soluble marker so that I know where to sew my buttons on. I forgot to record myself doing this again, but I bravely sewed them onto the dress using the sewing machine. I did break a button, but no injuries were made. If you decide to do it this way, I urge you to be careful and maybe consider wearing some safety goggles or big glasses to cover your eyes. But nevertheless, once that was done, the last and final step is hemming. So for the hemming, there's two ways you can do it. One way is to overlock the whole bottom of the dress and then iron it at your seam allowance line and then just do a straight stitch. Or if you want like a clean finished inside, you can do a, what's it called, a double folded hem. So you fold it in once and fold it again and then do a straight stitch. But after I finished hemming, the dress was finally finished. It took me nearly 2 weeks to do this in between work and life in general. But if I'm honest, it could easily be done in 1 to 2 days of complete sewing. But without any more talking, let's go on to the final reveal. So that brings us to the end of the video, guys. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up because it really helps my channel and it boosts my video through the YouTube algorithm. Side note from that, thank you so much for helping me clock 1,000 subscribers. Like, it's been a year, just over a year now, and I actually didn't think I'd have 1,000 subscribers by now. So I really want to thank you for that, even though sometimes my uploads are a bit whack in the sense of timing, only once a month. But I do want to become more frequent with my uploads, so hopefully like twice a month. I'll have my sewing 101 videos out, which are good for referencing so that you can learn how to do zipper flies, shirring, pockets, this, that and another, so like you can always come back to those videos to teach you how to do things. Even I will probably have to come back to them because you easily forget these things. But yeah, I have some exciting videos coming soon. I have some client order videos where I'll be just filming the process of me making customer orders, and also I got a mannequin so I can start doing like special occasion like ball gown dresses, do you know what I mean, just something different. I've always wanted to do that. But yeah, so stay tuned for those things, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. And again, I just want to thank you so much for all the support that you guys are giving me, and hopefully I'll see you in my next video. Bye guys. This is the placket for the front of the dress, just like in my pink ruched centered a centimeter away from that, and this is just so that I could why did I do that? Haha. Wait there, let me think about this.
It's gone.
Oh, it's a ladybird.
My man.
Okay.